Okay, I want to welcome you all to tonight's program and congratulate you on getting here in this wet weather, which I wasn't quite expecting it to continue this evening. So, and please continue to get food that is compliments of El Buen Amigo. They're a wonderful restaurant in North Scranton if you haven't been there before. So please enjoy the food with the program. So you're here tonight to hear about the migrant workforce behind NEPA's agricultural industry, historical realities, and current implications. My name is Julie Schumacher-Cohen. I serve the university as Assistant Vice President for Community Engagement and Government Affairs. And tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Office of Community Relations, the Multicultural Center, so thank you to Jose Sanchez, together with Marywood University and the Lackawanna Historical Society. I had a chance to see the initial presentation that Jenny did at the Waverly Community House at a program hosted by the Lackawanna Historical Society in the spring, and immediately I wanted to bring Jenny to campus to have more community members and students be able to hear about the work that she's been doing. Our region rightly takes pride in the many immigrants who came to this area, especially during the industrial era, the coal mining era, but sometimes we pay less attention and we provide less welcome to more recent immigrants and refugees. And I think a really important element of the research is that it shows that migration to this area by individuals coming from Central America is actually not all that new or recent. It actually dates back more than 80 years ago. So our speaker, who'll be introduced in just a minute more fully, Jenny Gonzalez Monge, does incredible work in our community on so many different fronts with youth empowerment programs and immigrant rights. And she did this research in addition to everything else she has on her plate. And so we're really grateful that she did. So she'll be talking about the history and especially focusing on the region's tomato industry, which was also new to me. So that's why it was out at the Waverly Community House, because that's where that area of the county was where the tomato industry was flourishing. And then again, how these historical realities reflect and are impact some of what's happening today with NEPA's Hispanic and Latino immigrant communities. I want to make two notes about the timing. We're hosting this during Hispanic Heritage Month, so we are honoring the region's Hispanic and Latino communities, all the different contributions that they have made, not just the workforce, but also starting small businesses, sharing, of course, like I mentioned tonight, El Buen Amigo, but sharing cultures and religion and cuisines and languages and so much more. So we're glad to do that. But it's also for those of us, as we think about being at a Catholic and Jesuit institution, it's also National Migration Week, which is something that the U.S. Catholic Church has celebrated for 45 years. And this year's theme is Migrants, Missionaries of Hope. It also coincides with the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, which is celebrated the last Sunday of every September. So that's this Sunday, September 28th. So, I'm mindful that these are commemorations week-long, day-long, that are coming in the midst of very harsh political rhetoric in this country, federal immigration policies of mass deportations, and so that we have a responsibility even more so to provide welcome and solidarity. It is ever more urgent to do that. So again, glad to be able to host tonight's program and share this important research. And so now I want to invite Daisy Corretto, Assistant Director for Community and Civic Engagement, up to introduce Jenny. Also want to note that we are recording the presentation portion of tonight's program, and then after the presentation, we'll also take some Q&A. And I think it's going to run for about an hour. And if we have lots of questions, we'll go a little bit over that. So thank you.
Hope you had a chance to try the tacos out. I wanted another one, but at the risk of having cilantro in my teeth, I decided not to. Thank you, Julie. Good evening, everyone. My name is Daisy Corretto, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Jenny Gonzalez is a licensed social worker who works at Marywood University as a program director of STARS, which stands for Students Together Achieving Remarkable Success. So if you see her around also on campus, she is at Elm Park Church. This is an after-school program for first-generation youth. Jenny has been working with and advocating for the civil and immigrant rights of the growing immigrant and refugee populations in NEPA for over a decade, through her work and continued involvement at the Community Justice Project. She also serves as a member of WVIA's Community Advisory Board and WVIA's Education Bilingual Advisory Board, and was a member of the steering committee of the Scranton Story, Our Nation's Story project. She conducted this research as a volunteer at the Lackawanna Historical Society. Please join me in welcoming Jenny Gonzalez.
So, good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? project that the University of Scranton and many other community organizations led, I met Marianne from the Lackawanna Historical Society. And I started to learn about a lot of the work that they've been doing there, documenting diverse immigrant populations, history, and culture that have been documented and archived in northeastern Pennsylvania. So of course, it got me thinking, I wonder what has been documented and archived during the past 2-3 decades for the Hispanic and Latino community that has been growing in northeastern Pennsylvania. And so through various conversations, I learned that there hasn't really been anything that was documented or archived. And she asked, would you be willing to help us at the Lackawanna Historical Society do this? And of course, I said yes. And I initially thought in my research, well, I'm going to start in the 90s. Why in the 90s? Because that's when my family moved from New York to northeastern Pennsylvania. So I thought, assuming there has to be some kind of documentation through newspaper articles about the growing Hispanic Latino community since the 90s. As I'm doing my research, I start learning that about the migrant workforce in northeastern Pennsylvania. And I start to learn that the migrant workforce that was coming to this region was very racially diverse. And a lot of these migrants were Hispanic and Latino immigrant migrants. And so that kind of is what delved me into this research of I want to know more about who these migrant workers were, what kind of work they were doing in northeastern Pennsylvania, and where they came from. So I did not ask this question. How do I? Oh, okay. So I want to start off by saying, just starting off with a few definitions by the AgriSafe Network. So migrants are people who move because they're following work. Migrant workers are mostly agricultural workers that are working in the agricultural industry for a temporary period of time and are usually not able to go back to their permanent residence overnight on a day-to-day basis. Seasonal workers are also agricultural workers who oftentimes are able to go back to their permanent residence overnight. So they're usually the ones that are not traveling too far. And then immigrants are people who have immigrated, usually from their place of birth to another location, which is usually another country. And this picture you see a migrant farm worker from Mexico who was working at the Roba family farm. And this picture, I believe, is from around 2008, 2009. I want to point that not all migrant workers are immigrants and not all immigrants are migrant workers. However, there is a growing number of immigrants that are migrant workers working in the agricultural field. The U.S. has a $1 trillion agricultural industry, and it currently hires approximately 3 million agricultural workers, both migrant and seasonal. And about 70% of these agricultural workers are foreign-born, which 63% of them are to be from Mexico. I want to share that a lot of the research that I found on the historical chronological timeline that I will be sharing with you shortly came from newspaper clippings and articles that I found online. And a lot of these newspaper articles talked about the migrant education program. So the Migrant Education Program provides supplemental educational services to migrant children and their families. And to be eligible for the Migrant Education Program in Pennsylvania, the adults, the migrant workers, have to work in some kind of field that has an agricultural component. So historically, it was usually farm workers, people out in the fields picking fresh produce. But that has transitioned over the years to people working in manufacturing companies, manufacturing food companies that deal with meat packing, tomato packing, poultry packing, and even slaughterhouses. Here you'll see a map of Pennsylvania, and Migrant Education Program has 4 regional offices. There's the West, the Northeast/Central, which is where we are, the East, and the Southeast regional office. Migrant Education Program started in 1959 in Pennsylvania, and it actually predated the federal Migrant Education Program that started in 1966. And historically, it has provided advocacy services, referral services, helping families with school registrations and making sure that their children are immunized, and supporting English language learners through tutoring and mentoring programs. So, in this research of the with that I was reading through these articles, I kept hearing about this fresh green tomato industry in northeastern Pennsylvania, and the three farms that came up in these articles for multiple decades in northeastern Pennsylvania were the Pullman's farms, the Eckel farms, and the Thompson farms. And these were thriving farms in Lackawanna County due to the migrant workforce that came to this region to pick tomatoes and to ship these tomatoes to different parts of the country. And they really depended, they thrived because of these migrant workers, and a lot of these farms had been in place working with migrant workers since the 1960s. So, as I'm doing my research, the earliest information that I found about migrant workers coming to northeastern Pennsylvania started in the 1940s. And what I learned were that there were about 15 acres of Lackawanna land that was being used to harvest tomatoes. And the majority of the workers on these lands were Polish Slovakian wives of coal miners that were in their 60s and 70s. By the 50s, we start to see the fresh green tomato industry growing. And so we start to see migrant workers coming from down south, mostly from Florida, to pick a lot of these to pick these tomatoes. The majority of these workers were African American Floridians, Mexican Americans from Texas, and Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico and Florida. They would spend the winter months down south picking citrus fruits, and then would come in the late summer months, early fall months to pick the fresh green tomatoes during the tomato harvest season in this region. At this time, there isn't really much funding from the federal government through migrant education program. However, because of this growing, booming industry, multiple religious institutions in the Tri-County area, which is Lackawanna, Luzerne, and Wyoming, come together and form this Tri-County Migrant Committee to try to, through volunteer work and donations, establish this spiritual ministry that provided recreational opportunities for the migrant families on these migrant camps, tutoring and educational supports for the children, meals, assistance with school enrollment, clothing. And they even had 3 daycare centers that provided childcare to some of these migrant families. At this point in the 1960s, northeastern Pennsylvania is estimated to produce over between 25 and 35 tons of tomatoes per acre in comparison to the statewide average of 5 tons per acre. And the majority of these tomatoes were sent to Canada and Puerto Rico. And of course, this required significant migrant workers to pick these tomatoes. So there were they calculated that there were about 1,000 migrant workers that came to 13 to 17 migrant camps across northeastern Pennsylvania and the northern part of the Commonwealth for this at the peak of the 6-week harvesting season. And of these approximate 1,000 migrant workers, there were several hundred migrant workers that spoke Spanish as their native language. So there was an article that talked about bringing in a Spanish chaplain from Kentucky to be able to offer interpretation services on these migrant camps, but also to be able to offer spiritual services and religious services to some of these migrant workers. At this time, it is estimated that around 500 acres of land in Lackawanna County are farmed by tomato growers, and that 70% of the money grossed from the sale of tomatoes all over the country stayed in Lackawanna County. So again, this specific agricultural boom that's happening in northeastern Pennsylvania is thanks to this very diverse migrant population that's coming to this region during the late summer and early fall months. And of course, there are significant challenges that are happening for the migrant workers in the 60s. There were a lot of issues with child labor because of loopholes in the federal law that allowed children during the summer months to be out in the fields picking tomatoes with their parents. There were a lot of educational challenges because of the amount of times that migrant families moved. There were a lot of issues with literacy, not only amongst the children, but their parents as well. language barriers amongst many migrant families. And there was even an article that quoted a local school district administrator who really discouraged from accepting migrant youth in in one of the local schools because children are usually far too behind their age levels and cannot cope with the educational load. So you start to see a little bit of some of the challenges and some of the discrimination that some of these migrant families are facing locally. There are high rates of poverty amongst the migrant workers, and it's because, and to this day, migrant workers are oftentimes undervalued. Many times these migrant workers are at the mercy of the crew leaders. And again, another article quoted one of the crew leaders in the local migrant camps that said, they're here to pick tomatoes, not to stop at a rest camp. So again, you start to gain some insight as to how some of these migrant workers were treated. They were not all treated terribly, but there was this mindset that, they were essentially machines that were producing a lot of money for a lot of local farms. There were also a lot of poor living conditions. There were about 13 migrant camps in the Tri-County area, and only 5 of the 13 passed the Department of Labor and Department of Health inspections in northeastern Pennsylvania. And there were various camps that were fined during the 60s because the living conditions that these migrant workers were being offered were described as horrible conditions. They were unsafe, they were unsanitary, there wasn't enough beds or blankets for the amount of migrant families that were in these migrant camps. They were overcrowded. There was a story that talked about there not being drainage systems in some of the showers. So some of these migrant workers had to shower in other people's dirty water that was just kind of standing there. They weren't being offered 5-star hotels to come to work this hard job. So this takes us into the 70s. In the 70s, we continue to see and learn that the migrant workforce is depending on Southern Black African American migrant workers, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Rican migrants. At this point in the 70s, we start to see federal funding trickling down at the state level. And so the migrant education program is starting to become more structured and more organized. And migrant education program at this point in 1971 is being administered by the Abington Heights School District. And they are offering educational support services at 3 local elementary schools within the Abington Heights School District, and I think there was one in Dallas at the time. The Tri-County Migrant Committee is still doing its volunteer work and providing social services and supports to the migrant communities. But we start to see that there is money that is coming down to northeastern Pennsylvania to offer structured social services and supports to the migrant families. And in this region, the Susquehanna Human Services Program is the one that was monitoring these programs for migrants across 11 counties in the eastern part of the state. This is during the time as well that we start to see a lot of community organizations and activists who start to kind of notice and pay attention and document to what's happening to these migrant workers, what they're experiencing, where they're living on these migrant camps, and the type of work that they're doing. And so we start to see that a lot of these advocates are starting to propose bills that provide more protection and more safety to these migrant workers. And finally, in 1978, the Pennsylvania Seasonal Farm Labor Act is passed, and it establishes minimum wage. It limits the number of hours per day per week that migrant workers should work. It forces farm owners to provide access to clean water. It gives these migrant workers tenants' rights, and it forces crew leaders to abide by state laws. At this point, the tomato industry in northeastern Pennsylvania has become a multi-million-dollar industry, and 3 county farms, again, Lackawanna, Luzerne, and Wyoming, are producing fresh green tomatoes for a significant part of the East Coast. And again, it's requiring hundreds and hundreds of migrant workers to be able to produce this amount of tomatoes to go to different parts of the country. And about half of those hundreds of migrant workers are being sent to work in two local farms in Lackawanna County, which is the Eckel Farm and the Thompson's Farm. In this picture, you see the project director of the Migrant Education Program having a meeting with some of the other staff and getting ready for the arrivals of the migrant families for the harvest season, and this has taken place in the Abington Heights School District. And this is another picture of Migrant Education Program teachers and staff working with migrant children and teaching them on how to bake cupcakes. And you see Gary and all the way at the back left corner, kind of just observing what's happening in the classroom. So then in the 1970s, we start to see other types of challenges. One of the challenges that we are seeing is migrant workers being forced to come to northeastern Pennsylvania before the tomato harvest season starts. And that was because of the drought that was happening down south. And that created a lot of tension on the migrant camps amongst the migrant workers because they didn't have work. So they weren't making money. So they either found themselves getting themselves in debt with the crew leaders or farm owners, or just a lot of tensions amongst the migrant workers because there were limited resources, limited food. So a lot of migrant workers found themselves applying for public benefits at the Scranton Department of Public Welfare. And that was also seen as very controversial because a lot of people in the community were seeing a lot of racially diverse men in downtown Scranton applying for public goods or public benefits that were often seen as being services that should only should be provided to the local community. Again, crew leaders oftentimes were exploiting these migrant workers by even charging them with inflated prices for essentials because a lot of these migrant workers didn't have access to transportation to leave the migrant camps out in rural parts of Pennsylvania to come to places like Scranton to buy essential things like toiletry or food. There was also a growing amount of tension between community organizations that were providing social services to these migrant workers and the farm owners. There was one article that talked about a social worker calling the police on a local farm owner because he wouldn't allow the migrants to have visitors. And so she thought that that was a way of controlling and maybe there was threats happening. But the farm owners said that the reason that they weren't allowing migrant workers to have visitors was because there was a lot of alcohol and smoking consumption and gambling issues. Again, in the 70s, a lot of these camps are not passing state inspections, and some farm owners are even proposing at this time that instead of federal money being used to provide social supports and services for the migrant families, that federal money should be used to be given to the farm owners to be able to provide adequate living conditions for these migrant workers. It is in the 70s that we start to learn that a lot of these migrant families are staying in northeastern Pennsylvania during the off season. And we learned this through an article that talks about 5 migrant families living in an apartment on Adams Avenue in downtown Scranton, and they were burning mattresses to be able to heat their apartment because they didn't have a working heating system in that apartment. And they ended up being put in a hotel. And in this article, these families are talking about or sharing that they know about 50 to 60 migrant families that are living in the Central Tech Redevelopment Project, which was a housing complex through the Scranton Housing Authority at the time. So again, and this is in January. So this is during the off season of the tomato harvest season. So again, we're starting to get some insight that a lot of these migrant workers are choosing to stay for one reason or another in northeastern Pennsylvania. This is a picture of 2 Black migrant workers on the Thompson farm in 1974, and this is a picture of Black and Hispanic migrant workers in line waiting to pick up their welfare checks in the city of Scranton in 1976. So then this takes us to the 80s. In the 80s, we start to see that Hispanic migrant workers are outnumbering Black Floridian workers. And specifically, we're seeing an increase in Mexican, Guatemalan, and Haitian immigrant migrant workers coming to Lackawanna County and the Tri-County area. And we know that this is an industry that's booming because the Abington Heights School District alone enrolled 250 migrant children in 1982. And they even received a $170,000 grant from the Pennsylvania Department of Education to provide social services and supports to families who stayed in the area after the season, the harvest season. So again, more insight that in the 80s there are still migrant families that are staying in the region. And a lot of the programming that they offered was literacy, math, swimming, and childcare. In the 1980s, this continues to be a multi-million-dollar industry. It is estimated that about 3,000 acres of northeastern Pennsylvania land is being used to harvest these tomatoes. They are still in need of hundreds and hundreds of migrant workers coming to this region, and a lot of these tomatoes are being shipped to Montreal, Miami, Puerto Rico, and St. Louis. It is in the 80s that we learn about the Migrant Child Development Program, which is a program that was developed to prevent child labor amongst migrant children. And it was created to serve migrant children in the Tri-County area, which again is Lackawanna, Luzerne, and Wyoming County. And so it provided social services, but also child care for a lot of these families. And the local child care center was at the Clark's Green United Methodist Church in is it Clark's Green? Clark's Green is different than Clark Summit, yes. In the 1980s, we start to see that there's two different migrant groups coming to northeastern Pennsylvania. There's the dairy workers that are mostly Caucasian men that are spending longer periods of time in this region and are working in the northern counties. And then there's the tomato pickers that came to the Tri-County area, Lackawanna, Luzerne, and Wyoming. And most of these workers are Hispanic migrant workers whose native language is Spanish. And they were known as the Eastern Stream migrants. And they spent less period of time in northeastern Pennsylvania. They were known as the Eastern Stream migrants because they really started their migrant work down south in Florida and worked their way up through Georgia, the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, and ended in New York. The three main farms that we continuously hear about are continuing to thrive. They are harvesting almost 1,000 acres of tomatoes and are relying on hundreds of migrant workers. We also learn about PAFO, which is a Pennsylvania Farm Worker Opportunity Office, and this office provides social supports and services as well to the migrant families. But it specifically started to provide support to help migrant families find jobs during the off season. And there was an article that talked about PAFO helping migrant families secure jobs after the tomato harvest at a meatpacking factory in Scranton, but it didn't say which one or what the name was. 1980s has its own set of challenges. We hear about Friends of Farm Workers, which is now called Justice at Works, sues the Thompson Farm in Lackawanna County because they weren't paying the migrant workers minimum wage and they were not giving them adequate living conditions. So federal judge Richard Conaboy granted the settlement, and the 33 migrant workers received around $400 each for their 1985 harvest. There are also growing new migrant crews, specifically amongst the Haitian immigrant migrant community. And of course, this was very different for some of the crew leaders and farm owners because the Haitian immigrant migrants spoke Haitian Creole. And a lot of these farm owners were used to working and understanding some of the Spanish language over the last 2 decades. So there were a lot of language barriers, miscommunication, and a lot of these Haitian immigrant migrant workers were new to the industry. So there was an article that talked about farm owners complaining because their profits plummeted a few years because these Haitian immigrant migrant workers didn't have the perfect skills yet in knowing when to pick these tomatoes. Also, the culture was a little bit different. The farm owners were used to working with Hispanic migrant workers, and a lot of these Hispanic migrant workers were Mexican and Guatemalan immigrants, and they were kind of just doing what they were told, following instructions, didn't really say much, just came in, did the work, and then left if they went back to wherever they lived. The Haitian workers were a little bit different. They voiced their concerns. They advocated for themselves, and they even led sit-down strikes on these farms. So a lot of the farm owners had a lot of complaints, and there was a lot of tensions with a lot of these Haitian migrant workers. There was also some documentation about growing health concerns because infant mortality was 125% above the national average, and the average lifespan of migrant workers in the entire country was approximately at 50 years of age. And of course, it's because of the type of work they're doing for multiple hours a day, stooping all day under the hot sun, and their skin is being exposed to all types of chemicals and pesticides. Remember, their safety isn't the primary concern of a lot of these agricultural companies or farm workers. And this is a picture of some of the Hispanic migrant workers picking tomatoes at the Eckel farm. And this picture, I believe, was the late 80s. In the 1980s, we see a new challenge. In the 1980s is when we start to see an influx of Hispanic and Latino immigrants coming to the United States, specifically coming from the southern border. And so that has a rippling effect in all types of industries, especially in this growing agricultural industry. There were a lot of migrant workers that were coming to northeastern Pennsylvania that did not have lawful immigration status. And so President Ronald Reagan passes the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. And it essentially starts to penalize employers for hiring undocumented immigrants. And it also starts to increase border patrol in the southern border. But it also has this very small special provision that provided undocumented migrant workers with a pathway to citizenship if they could prove that they worked for a certain amount of time in some kind of agricultural sector. And this was a game changer for a lot of immigrants, undocumented immigrant families, because it really changed the trajectory of their life. They were no longer going to be undocumented, living in the shadows, and now they didn't have to worry about getting deported. I know from a conversation with Stephanie Bressler, who is still very involved in the Scranton community through her volunteer work at United Neighborhood Centers, that because she was involved with some of the migrant advocacy work in the 1980s, she and another gentleman received a grant to be able to go out into these migrant camps in northeastern Pennsylvania and educate these undocumented migrants about this new law and to basically help them gather the documentation they needed to apply for this immigration relief. And that was a very important and touching story for me because it really hit home, because my father was able to adjust his immigration status due to this amnesty in 1986 because he was a farm worker in California. So, of course, I know that truly does change a family's trajectory in the United States when they are no longer undocumented or unauthorized. And then this is a quote from President Ronald Reagan saying, "Illegal immigrants in considerable numbers have become productive members of our society and are a basic part of our workforce. Those who have established equities in the U.S. should be recognized and accorded legal status. At the same time, in so doing, we must not encourage illegal immigration." Hence why a part of this amnesty, there was significant funding for Border Patrol. In the early mid-90s, again, the fresh green tomato industry is booming in northeastern Pennsylvania, and it's generating the Commonwealth about $320 million. It still depends on hundreds of migrant workers coming to this region to pick these tomatoes. And at this point, 95% of the migrant workers are Mexican and Guatemalan migrant workers. We know that a lot of religious institutions are coming together continuously to welcome these migrant families and to offer celebratory masses through baptisms, holy communions, and weddings. And a lot of these services were even offered in Spanish in the early 90s. We learn about PRO, which is basically the same thing as PAFO from the 1980s. It's just changed their name. They're located in the same church. They're offering the same services, including offering training programs and employment search and assistance for migrant workers during the off season in this region. And we see that a lot of migrants, again, are staying because we're starting to see an uptick in numbers of children registered into the Scranton School District. This is a picture of one of the celebratory events and masses at St. Gregory's, and you see some of the migrant workers in the back. And I guess they're having dinner or lunch. In the early 90s, we start to see the Migrant Education Program officially partner with Marywood University. And they start offering summer day programs. They're offering computer classes, swimming programs, ESL classes. They even opened their own Migrant Head Start program for these families. And here you see a picture of a swimming instructor with migrant children. She's teaching migrant children how to swim. And the reason the swimming lessons were a part of the migrant education program is because during the time, the number one cause of death amongst migrant children were that they were drowning. So that was a very important piece to the migrant education program curriculum. By the late 90s, we're seeing this growing community collaboration between Migrant Education Program, Marywood University, Catholic Social Services, Boys and Girls Club, and the Scranton Pocono Girl Scouts. And the top left picture, you see Jerry Soltaro, who was the Parent Involvement Social Services Coordinator, and he's having a meeting with some of these migrant parents. His job was to go out into these migrant camps and talk to these families about the migrant education program, enroll them into the program so that their children would benefit from these programs that happened at Marywood's campus. And the bottom picture, you see migrant children doing nutritional activities at Marywood University. That picture in particular really stood out to me because I recognize some of these students because I went to high school with some of these students. And it really triggered a thought and put me down this memory lane roller coaster. And through conversations with my parents, I realized that I went to some of the Marywood summer camps in the late 90s. And so then I learned that I was a part of the migrant education program because in the late 90s, my mother started working at Maid-Rite Steak Company in Dunmore. And it's essentially a freezer where they're packing frozen meats to be shipped off to different parts of the country. And because she was new to this industry, she was new to the area, she was considered a migrant worker because it had that agricultural component. So it just kind of came full circle that my research kind of took me into this migrant education program, or stumbling into the information about the migrant education program, and then to realize that I was kind of a part of that local history was kind of, I don't know, a full circle moment. The 1990s had, again, similar challenges as previous decades, but one of the newer challenges were, one, the language barriers and the culture shock for a lot of the immigrant Guatemalan migrant workers, because not only were they navigating the English language, but they were also navigating, in many instances, the Spanish language, because a lot of these migrant workers spoke indigenous languages that were native to the region that they came from in Guatemala. There were also growing immigration concerns. So in 1993 or 94, but it was a December, the first major ICE raid happens in the city of Scranton, and over 100 immigrants are detained and deported. And 90% of them are deported to Mexico, and the rest are deported to Central America. And because of this ICE raid, a lot of these, their family members, wives, and children were left to fend for themselves, were left in a financial crisis, and started to seek services at Catholic Social Services. And there was a social worker, a Marywood grad, who, because of this traumatic experience for these families and trying to connect them to social supports and financial supports, she's the one that started the first Hispanic outreach office at Catholic Social Services. So that was a very interesting part of the history that I wasn't aware of. And as I'm doing this research, I bring this conversation up to my parents because when this happened, I knew that we had recently moved to Scranton. And I learned that my father had worked at Robson's slaughterhouse and had quit his job a few months before this ICE raid had happened. I don't know what would have happened to him if he was there, because he was still in that adjustment of status application process because of the amnesty of 1986. But again, another story that kind of really hit home without knowing that it was going to hit home. So then in the 2000s, a lot of the articles that I found in my research kind of stopped talking about the the fresh tomato industry in this region. And really, a lot of the articles started to talk about the educational programming at Keystone College and at Camp Archbald. We learned that in the 2000s, the Migrant Education Program did a variety of programming in the local school districts, but there was a story about a Scranton High School senior presenting and advocating for the Migrant Education Program at the Pennsylvania House Chamber. We also learned that Keystone College hosted the Latino Project, which was multiple pictures of documenting the growing Hispanic and Latino community in the early 2000s. And the majority of these pictures were being taken at the Eccles Farm and at Nativity of Our Lord. Nativity of Our Lord was essentially that safe haven, that church in South Scranton that really started to welcome a lot of these Hispanic and Latino immigrants that started moving and establishing roots in this region, especially in the 90s. And it was one of the first churches that started to offer Spanish service and Mass. It later became St. John Newman's Parish, and unfortunately, it closed in June of this year. So there were a lot of families that were very emotional and heartbroken because this was the church that welcomed the growing Hispanic and Latino community. That's why there's such a large number of Hispanic and Latinos in South Scranton. A lot of the articles in the 2000 eras, we learned that there are a growing number of migrant workers that are refugees, people that are coming from Ethiopia, from Sudan, from Nepal, some from Puerto Rico, Colombia, Venezuela. So we're starting to see the demographics changing within the migrant workforce that is coming to this region. And we also learned that a lot of the educational services that are offered at these universities are servicing children not necessarily that live in northeastern Pennsylvania. A lot of these children were coming from Lancaster, Westchester, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. So that was a little bit different in comparison to Marywood University providing educational services to mostly migrant children that lived in the Tri-County area. We also learned that the Migrant Education Program has expanded its services to not only include farm workers, which again, earlier in the history was the majority of these farm workers were the tomato pickers, but to include migrant workers that were working in these processing plants in poultry, beef, pork, and even to include some workers in lawn care and landscaping. And some of the food manufacturing companies that some of these migrant workers have worked for and have received services from Migrant Education Program are Maid-Rite Steak Company, David Elliott Poultry Farm in South Scranton, and Cargill Taylor Beef, which is in Hazleton and I believe in Wyalusing. Here are some pictures. This is one of the pictures being showcased at the Linder Gallery at Keystone College, a little girl on the Echo Farm, and these are some of the migrant education program staff that were, they won the Finley Ethics Award at Misericordia University. So the 21st century brings its own set of problems. The Echo Farm closes after multiple decades of harvesting fresh green tomatoes. And the main reason it closes in 2008 is because they don't have the labor force to be able to continue this work. And there aren't many migrant workers that are coming to northeastern Pennsylvania to do this type of work because in 2006, 7, 8, there's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies that are happening, especially in Hazleton, when Mayor Lou Barletta passed that anti-immigrant ordinance where it penalized employers and homeowners from employing and renting to undocumented immigrants. And at the time as well, there were 3 major ice raids that happened in this region. One was at a Scranton plant. Another one was at a plastic manufacturing plant in East Stroudsburg. And the other one was at the TJ Maxx warehouse in Pittston. So again, bad news flies very fast, and there wasn't a lot of incentive for a lot of these migrant workers to want to come to Pennsylvania to do this type of agricultural work. So what we learned that a lot of farms across the Commonwealth started to look to the H-2A visas, which is this program that allows agricultural companies or farm owners to go abroad and recruit migrant workers through these H-2A visas. And one local farm that has done that was the Roba family farm. And they learned that it was a very expensive, extensive, and complex system to navigate just to bring 4 migrant farm workers to work on their farm. And although the H-2A visa program might be an okay alternative to try to meet this agricultural workforce need, it has its own issues that have especially been documented in the last decade. H-2A workers are susceptible to a lot of exploitation because they're kind of bounded to the company or the farm owner that brings them to this country to work on a temporary basis. And so many of them have been found to be living in substandard living conditions. Many of them have been forced to work in unsafe working conditions, and many of them have been victims to trafficking through free labor, because of some of them have shared stories about getting themselves in debt to be able to come to this country, to be able to work for these companies. And others have been sexually trafficked, especially a lot of the women in the migrant agricultural work. At this time as well, the pandemic happens. And so a lot of these migrant workers, and this is not just specific to northeastern Pennsylvania, this was seen more in the central part of Pennsylvania, were working in overcrowded living conditions and weren't really given the space to quarantine. They had limited access to health care because a lot of mobile health clinics that were going onto these migrant camps stopped going to these migrant camps. So they didn't have access to getting tested for COVID-19 or being treated for any other health issues that were happening. And OSHA temporarily halted field safety and sanitation inspections on these migrant farms because migrant workers are seen as essential workers, and they don't want to disrupt the food supply chain in this country. And these are some pictures of some of the migrant workers from Mexico that were working at the Roba family farms in like 2008, 2009. And so then Pennsylvania has its own workforce challenges. For every 100 available jobs, there are 60 unemployed Pennsylvanians available to fill these jobs, leaving about 40 jobs on average unfilled due to the labor shortage. Why is there a labor shortage in the Commonwealth? It's because there's an aging population, which this morning in our meeting at WVIA, I learned that 1 in 4 Pennsylvanians are over the age of 60, and by 2030, 1 in 3 Pennsylvanians will be over the age of 60. So you can see that our workforce is decreasing in the Commonwealth. And there's a declining population because there aren't many families having a lot of children, and a lot of families are moving out of Pennsylvania. So that is creating this labor shortage in Pennsylvania. And the counties that have suffered the most of this population loss are the rural counties, and they're projected to decline by 5.8% over the next 3 decades. While simultaneously, urban areas in Pennsylvania will see a population increase of about 1.5%. It is important to note that from 2010 to 2020, for every 10 non-Hispanic Pennsylvanians that left Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania gained 12 persons of color. And we've seen the substantial growth specifically from the Hispanic and the Latino immigrant and non-immigrant community moving to the Commonwealth. And of course, with population loss, there's rippling effects because there are lower income taxes, there are less revenue, which increases the rise in inflation. And in Pennsylvania, we specifically saw an 8.2 increase in grocery prices from 2022 to 2023, which was about 2%. It was a 2% increase, higher increase than some of our neighboring states, which New Jersey, I think, saw about a 6% increase in grocery prices. The agricultural industry in Pennsylvania has been the industry most impacted by this population loss in the Commonwealth. Pennsylvania's agricultural industry is worth about $132 billion, and 24% of its agricultural workers are immigrants. And in the U.S., about 33% of the agricultural workers are immigrants. So we are seeing that the agricultural industry not only needs migrant and seasonal workers, but they need immigrant, migrant, and seasonal workers to fill in these workforce needs. And in Pennsylvania, in this map, you see that we need agricultural workers in the Northwest, the Northeast, South Central, and Southeast. The Pennsylvania immigrant workforce in this region, in Pennsylvania, is about 9.7% of the total labor force in Pennsylvania. And the industries with the highest percentage of immigrants are agriculture, service, construction, and manufacturing, which includes food manufacturing. 29% of Pennsylvania workers in the food industry are immigrants, and 24% of the Pennsylvania agricultural workers are immigrants. And of that 24%, around 15% are undocumented immigrants. Because in the agricultural the workforce available to fill in some of these agricultural industries' needs has over the years decreased. A lot of these agricultural industries have been turning to the H-2A visa programs to be able to meet some of these unmet workforce needs. And so it has been documented that there has been an increase by 236% in the Northeast, and that includes Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Maryland, New Jersey. There was an article that talked about there being around 4,500 migrant workers, both documented and undocumented, coming to the state of Pennsylvania on a temporary basis. And on this map, you're seeing that Luzerne and Lackawanna County are starting to increase their numbers on H-2A migrant workers to come to the region on a temporary basis. So anywhere from 50 to 100 H-2A migrant workers. I also just wanted to point out that the immigrant population in Pennsylvania is about 8% of the total PA population, and about 30% of these immigrants are from Latin America, 40% are from Asia, and 18% are from Europe. And although Asians are the largest immigrant group in Pennsylvania, the fastest growing immigrant group is Latino or Hispanic. And over half of these immigrants are naturalized citizens, and about 44% of them are non-citizens. And that includes people with green card holders to people with DACA, people with other types of immigration statuses. And of that 44% of non-citizens, about 19% are undocumented or unauthorized immigrants, which constitute about 1.5% of the total Pennsylvania population and 1.9% of the total Pennsylvania workforce population, which is approximately 196,000 undocumented immigrants in Pennsylvania. But despite their immigration statuses, they are contributing to our economy. They have paid about $1.2 billion in federal, state, and local taxes and have a total spending power of over $4 billion in the Commonwealth. And about 9.7% of immigrants constitute about 9.7% of the total Pennsylvania workforce. And they have contributed to the tax system by about $13.6 billion and have a total spending power of about $40 billion. And that's both documented and undocumented immigrants. I also thought it was very interesting that about approximately 67,000 immigrants in Pennsylvania are entrepreneurs, and over 12,000 of those 67 are undocumented immigrants who are, again, contributing to our community. And this is another snapshot of how the Hispanic and Latino immigrant and non-immigrant community is helping reverse the population loss in northeastern Pennsylvania, with the greatest percentage in growth in a 4-year period in Schuylkill and in Luzerne County. And this is a picture of the Latino Fiesta at Naog Park. I think it was from last summer. And that is organized and led by the Giving Back to the Community group, which is led by, I believe, 4 or 5 Latina women that live in Scranton. So in conclusion, Pennsylvania needs immigrants and migrants more than immigrants and migrants need Pennsylvania. And I quote that from the Pennsylvania Immigration Coalition, which is a conference that I went to earlier this year. And it really stuck with me because I was like, yes, this is true. The Commonwealth is in dire need of immigrants and migrants to continue to come to this, to not only work in the Commonwealth, but to establish roots in the Commonwealth. So how do we attract these immigrants and migrants? Through welcoming policies and what has worked in other parts of the country: sanctuary cities, refugee resettlement programs, language access policies, driver's licenses for all. Like, that is one of the most important things that I hope Pennsylvania is able to implement. Ending 287G agreements, which essentially allows local law enforcement to act as immigration officers. We need more people to advocate for immigration reform at the federal level, to create pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, for DACA recipients, for TPS holders, and for many other immigrant groups. We need it to reduce the backlogs and the family petitions, because there shouldn't be people waiting 25 years to finally get a sibling to come into this country the legal way. There are a lot of backlogs in the court systems and even in the U-Visa humanitarian immigration relief program. And modernize the asylum system, which is too complex, and now it's becoming expensive as well. And just too many people just in limbo, waiting for years. And the reality is that because we are not, in general, we don't have enough people working in the agricultural industry, many agricultural companies and farms are going to continuously look to the H-2A visa workers. And so if that's going to be the case, if we're going to continue bringing H-2A visa workers from abroad, they deserve fair wages. They deserve transparency in the contracts that they have with these farm owners and these agricultural companies. They deserve overtime and hour protections under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And they deserve for the government to enforce the safe living conditions that they are provided by these private companies. So the key takeaways are that immigrant and migrant workers are the backbone of the food supply chain. The food supply chain depends on the food manufacturing, food service, and food retail industry, which depends on the agricultural industry, which depends on the migrant workforce, which heavily depends on the immigrant workforce, both documented and undocumented. Pennsylvania needs migrants and immigrants to reverse the population loss and decrease the labor shortage that the Commonwealth is experiencing, to eventually prevent farm closures, massive food shortages, price spikes, and economic chaos. We need immigrants and migrants to come to this region to boost our population and our economic growth. But I also want to point out that immigrant, migrant workers, and all migrant and seasonal workers in the agricultural industry should not just be seen as essential workers. These are humans, these are parents, these are aunts and uncles, siblings, who have families, who have dreams, aspirations, who have rights, and who deserve to be treated with love, compassion, respect, justice, and human dignity as any other member of our community. So with that, I do want to end with a few quotes that I kind of highlighted during my research that give a little bit more of insight of the life of the migrant worker. There was a quote from a panelist at the Abington Heights PTA meeting in the 1960s that said, "Tomato growers in particular have a need for cheap labor. Migrants have the experience and know-how in handling green tomatoes. Regional workers would have to be broken in and would cost more to hire." A quote from Miss Rose Tucker in 1970. "These workers aid the economy of the 3 counties by supplying labor which cannot be met by the supply locally." Patricia Williams, 1984. "The state's economy is heavily dependent on farming and relies on migrant workers for survival. Farming is a multi-million-dollar business in our area, and it would not work without migrant farmers." 1987, Joyce Hatala. "Migrants are vital to the area farm economy and that they are doing work others, such as college students, are not willing to do not have the skills to do, and likely could not handle 10 hours per day bent over in the fields in the hot sun. Anyone who eats fresh fruits and vegetables is the beneficiary of their labor, and we all owe them a debt." Stephanie Bressler, 1990. "We're rich, very rich, because immigrants still come, and it takes someone else to pick crop, and they should be respected and loved. There is no doubt migrant workers play a very vital, important role in our economy." 1990, Monsignor John Esseff. "The farm industry would not prevail if we use them as things and machines and not recognized as people in love and children of God." Rich Paulman, the owner of the Paulman Farm, said, "Without these people, I'm not in business. They are not a burden to the taxpayer. They are not living on welfare." And a article from 2008 was talking about farm workers in Pennsylvania. "Farmers say migrants are integral to their operations because local laborers will not work short, intense harvest seasons." So again, they're not only essential workers, they are human beings, as I mentioned before. And that's all. Thank you. Does anybody have?
Take questions for a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Jenny. First, I want to say I'm a little bit offended by the Marywood bias in the presentation.
I'm sorry.
No, no, it was great. It was really excellent. I was wondering, it seemed like, I wonder if you could just say a little more about this. It seems like the local politics sort of shift one way and then the other way over the history. Like sometimes the migrant workers were more accepted politically and culturally, and other times there seems to be more resistance. And I just wondered if you detect any patterns in that, or I don't know.
So politics only really came up in my research during the time that the anti-immigrant ordinance was passed in Hazleton. That was really at least locally, that was really the only time that I saw like specific policy aimed at immigrants in this region. I'm trying to think. I mean, the 1980s immigration reform, that was really more at the federal level. But again, it impacted, the majority of the migrant workers that were impacted were down in the West Coast, southern part of the country. But again, through my conversation with Stephanie Bressler, I didn't realize that it was through her conversation that I realized that a lot of this migrant workforce was undocumented in the 1980s. But again, I didn't, at least so far, I haven't found a lot of information specific to the local politics on the immigrant and migrant workforce in this region.
Could you say that bias, though, that was coming up with the people waiting for the welfare checks, that was also part of that kind of
Yes.
atmosphere?
I would believe so, because, you know, not only were they not from Pennsylvania, specifically northeastern Pennsylvania, but they also looked different. You know, they spoke different languages. So I can't imagine in the 70s how they were seen in downtown Scranton in line picking up welfare checks. So
first off, thank you for digging up a piece of history that really needs to be known. In that, as you were saying, the process you had to go through this, is anyone paying attention right now to what the current conditions are and how they're going to impact the agriculture industry. Have you had any conversations with people that are starting to be aware of the how it's going to impact our region?
So there are people doing the Lord's work when it comes to farm workers across the Commonwealth. So Justice at Works, which I mentioned in the presentation, Friends of Farm Workers, they have historically been doing advocating for workers' rights. And during this time, it was specifically agricultural workers, and they're still continuing to do that. But their focus is now more on immigrants in all industries, not just the agricultural industry. There's also another program called the Farm Workers Project, and that's through the Philadelphia Legal Aid program, and they are sending in community outreach workers into different parts of central Pennsylvania to basically monitor what's happening. They are seeing some of the same challenges that we've seen before with unsafe living conditions. A lot of these migrant workers being owed wages because of this debt system that they find themselves in, either to crew leaders or, again, the actual farm companies that are bringing them here. And I know that one of the challenge that they're having is that, especially for the H-2A visa workers, because that's what seems to be happening from my conversation with them, that a lot of the migrant workers, you saw there's a 236% increase in H-2A visa migrant workers coming to the northeastern part of the country. But when these outreach workers are going out into parts of central Pennsylvania, and they specifically told me, we haven't really gotten to northeastern part of Pennsylvania. It's been mostly in the central part of Pennsylvania. A lot of these migrant workers don't even want to talk to them because their fear is this company is not going to bring me back and I need to come back. I don't want to risk my life coming through the border. And if I piss this company off, they're just not going to renew my visa. They're not going to petition me to come back. So they said that has been the biggest challenge when it has come to the migrant workforce in central Pennsylvania. And again, when I did ask them if they have been doing any work in the Northeast, they said not necessarily. And in one of the maps, you see that the largest amount of migrant workers currently are mostly concentrated in the central and south part of Pennsylvania. And that's where hundreds of H-2A visa workers are also coming. So I think that's why they've concentrated their work. But I am not aware of local organizations that are actually going out into migrant farms. I mean, I don't know specific numbers of migrant workers in Lackawanna County right now. Again, one of the maps showed that there are anywhere from 50 to 100 H-2A visa workers that are migrant workers in the region. But I agree. I think and this political administration is actually pushing for H-2A visa workers to come because they're a vulnerable population to exploit. And they don't really necessarily have a pathway to citizenship. They're just here on a temporary basis, and they are kind of controlled by that company that's bringing them here. And all of the departments that would traditionally and historically look into these violations of workers' rights that's not necessarily the priority right now under this political climate.
Hi, I just want to make a comment. Thank you, Jenny. I first became aware of migrants many, many years ago when I was working as a clerk in the outpatient department of Moses Taylor. And once a week, the 3 farms would bring the migrants down, and there were doctors there that gave their services, and Moses Taylor gave their time and money to take care of them as they were coming in. And I got to know a lot of nice people. And I don't know if that came up in your, when you were looking or not, but Dr. Peter Couple was the head of it. And he was great with them. They just loved him. But thank you for this. It brought me back to those days. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. No, that didn't come across my research, but I will document his name and look him up in the research as I move forward with it. Thank you.
Well, once again, I want to thank you for for the research, the time, and the passion, the commitment that is seen through your presentation and digging in and learning. I think for me, it touched one of the quotes that I think it was from one of the owners from the Palmon farm. As a person who has been scream up and say, go back to your country, stop stealing our jobs. Like when you see the contribution economically and financially that we are not a burden. I don't know if that was the exact words, a burden on taxpayers or welfare. And looking at the numbers that you provide us with your research about the financial contributions and growth in our communities, it says a lot about what migrant or immigrants populations are doing in our country. And I agree. I hope that I don't know where your research is going to take you next, or if there's a next step, I look forward to see what's the next step where we can bring this knowledge, this awareness, because the numbers that you provided are, especially thinking about our state that is losing a lot of their workforce, being because of the weather. There are people that are moving to warmer states because the weather that we have in Pennsylvania for other reasons, retirement, all that. It's important Pennsylvania is a beautiful state and it has a lot of land. It's a lot of agriculture, and this will be a way to sustain it and to make sure it doesn't disappear.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take one, maybe this will be the last question.
So obviously, as we saw in the videos, these camps and these programs that are for children are especially important because they're able to find community in there, and they're able to feel like, yay, this is a happy, joyous occasion where I can celebrate being me. In this day where I feel like there's a lot of rising hatred against immigrants, have we seen a proportional growth with the growth of immigrants in the area? Have we seen proportional growth of these children's programs that seem so important?
For one, the migrant education program is still offering these youth educational programs and also programming for the adults. I can speak about our program as well, and there's other multiple programs that have served a lot of immigrant children, like the University of Success at the University of Scranton. But the STARS program, it was created to serve specifically children of Hispanic and Latino immigrants in 2018 because it is the fastest growing minority group in not only Pennsylvania, but in the entire country. And they are the future of this country. So I do think that little by little, we're starting to see more and more programming that's trying to target these diverse populations that are growing in this region. King's College also offers a variety of programming specifically for children of Hispanic or Latino background, and that has been running since 2006, I believe, and they have served elementary school, middle school, and high school students, and have even offered full ride scholarships to Hispanic and Latino individuals that pursue higher education at King's College. And the majority of those scholarship recipients were children of immigrants, if not immigrants themselves. So at least in the time that I've lived in northeastern Pennsylvania, I have seen a growing number of programs that are targeting these different specific groups that are growing in our region. I don't know.